to Zebra Spotlight. I'm Arthur, the cinema guy from Zebra Home Cinema, and I'm really excited to introduce you all to Ramsey Avery. And now, Ramsey is a veteran production designer from TV, Hollywood, stage, and he's got a really, really interesting bio. And I want to introduce using the bio just to explain a few amazing things. So, Ramsey is an astrophysics major from the University of Wyoming. And if I just read this out, Ramsey was always interested in how worlds were created, acting in the theatre at night while sorting differential equations in the day. He discovered that there were many worlds that he could make here on this one, and that he could travel anywhere on stage and in film. Ramsey, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking.
Now, considering it's 6 a.m. where you are, you look far too alert and bright.
Well, like I said, it's just the way the industry works. It's very early in the morning to very late at night, so I'm used to it.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll get into that. I'm intrigued to know a bit more about your background. So, you did astrophysics. From sort of childhood to early on. Just tell me about your journey in reaching the stars, and then how that transpired into what you do on a daily basis.
Well, I mean, it literally, my family, my teachers are both ed my parents are both educators, one in math and one in science, and so that was just kind of the path that I was going to take. And certainly growing up in Wyoming, there weren't a lot of other options to, you were either going to be an engineer, work on the railways, or do something kind of very tangible. And I always loved how things came together, how what made things tick, where they started was always very interesting to me. And spent a lot of time outdoors and kind of creating my own worlds as I was imagining things in my backyard and wandering around. And somehow those things all kind of came together. I loved theater in high school and in college, but it certainly wasn't a practical career. There was no way to make any money in it. So I followed my heart into to astronomy. And I had a really great time my first year in college doing a lot of theater work in the evenings, and kind of just realizing that's where my heart was really lying. And I had an uncle who was a fairly famous astronomer, and so he also was a great patron of the arts in the San Francisco area. So I gave him a call one day and said, I really love astronomy. I really love the theater. I don't know what I want to do with my life. And he said, well, you know what? There is no money to be made in astronomy. There's no money to be made in the theater. So what do you want to spend the rest of your life not making any money in? And I was like, well, that's an interesting way to put it. So if I'm not going to make any money, I'm going to do where my heart really lies. And I went in like a couple of days later and changed my majors to theater. And my GPA didn't hold up. It seemed to be suddenly it was a lot harder to act than it was to figure out math. But it was where I wanted to be, and it's kind of just led me from one step to another to being able to work with wonderful people and travel all around the world and make new worlds on a regular basis.
That's fascinating. And from that early age, what were the sort of were there any particular influences from either stage or TV or film productions where you thought that's what I want to be doing, that's what I want to be creating?
It really wasn't until I was older that I kind of recognized that that was a thing, that you made these worlds. It wasn't, growing up, I didn't understand that that was part of the creative process, that something that shows up on a screen is something that somebody figured out and made. I saw a theater production of Dracula in San Francisco, and it was the Frank Langella version, and the whole stage was done in the Edward Gorey. He designed it, and it was all his pen sketches, black and white. And I remember there was one scene that opened up with this single red rose amidst all that black and white, and suddenly that idea of that red rose representing Nina and also representing blood and representing life and also representing death. And it's like all of a sudden it's like, wow, somebody came up with this visual that means something. And that kind of was the first moment that it really clicked to me
Hmm.
that by affecting what was around the actors, that's where you also told the story.
Hmm.
And at that point, I was still thinking about science, but it's always kind of rendered back to me about that's what we do as designers, we're creating a world
Hmm.
where we want the audience to gain an understanding about what's happening with the characters and what are the tools and the processes and the emotions and the history and the antecedents, all the stuff that we can bring together
Hmm.
to sculpt that world for an audience to understand and better engage with the story.
Hmm. Now, talking about worlds, I mean, I mentioned that you work in Hollywood, and some of the work that's been attributed to what you've done include Minority Report, 10 Cloverfield Lane, the and we'll come on to discuss some of your other newer projects. But one of the things that struck out for me, particularly when it comes to designing worlds, was when the first season of Lord of the Rings of Power came out. Now, it's hailed as one of the most extravagant, glorious-looking productions, and probably one of the most expensive productions to stream on TV from Amazon Studios. And everything just looks epic and gorgeous, and then you think to yourself, well, clearly there's a certain amount of CGI and visual effects, but there's a lot of scenes where people are actually in a world that's tangible. You can feel, you can touch things. And let's talk about production design, because I certainly don't think it's something that's touched upon or discussed very often. People talk about the direction or the cinematography, the sound design, but what an amazing world that was created. So I want you to tell the audience what you do specifically, because it's incredible.
Well, it is funny. It's like you said, people understand a cinematographer or a director of photography because everybody can hold a camera and point it, and they understand the process of taking a picture. And people understand costumes, like everybody wears clothes, so we understand what costumes are. And directing, well, we all listen to directors talk about how they do their process, right? So there are these things that seem very tangible to the audience, and to producers. And one of the things that just is simply intangible is the craft of production design, because it really is all encompassing. Pretty much anything other than what a director, I mean, what a character or an actor wears and how the scene is filmed, everything else is the production designer. The location, the environment around, the things that an actor picks up, the car they drive in, everything literally that is not kind of the actor or on the actor is something that somebody somewhere had to figure out, and that somebody is the production designer. And it is interesting to me that it is such an amorphous craft and amorphous art that even producers, strangely enough, have a very difficult time understanding what it is that we do, which leads to interesting battles and conversations on a fairly regular basis. But really, what the core idea of a production designer is that there really are two components to a piece of narrative media. There is the performance, and then there's the context. And the context is visual because it's a visual media. And so that visual context is what the production designer is responsible for. Now, they don't do it by themselves. They have to work with the DP and the director. But the idea is what the production designer doing is crafting that environment that is being seen where the performance takes place. And the goal of crafting that environment is to enhance and explain and enliven the performance. So what you're talking about with Lord of the Rings is we were charged with multiple things on that project. I was actually brought in halfway through pre-production because the previous designer just wasn't working out, and they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working out. So they wanted somebody to come in, and they gave me a series of rules that they wanted me to follow. And the rules were, in some ways, kind of arbitrary, but they turned out to be very useful. And those rules basically were, if it can be real, it needs to be real. So whatever is in the general context of an actor and within the screen, if we can make it real, it needs to be real because it's already a fantasy world, and it has to be as tangible and believable as we can make it. So if we rely on visual effects, everybody knows it's visual effects. So you have to figure out how to put everything in camera. The second major rule was when an audience member tuned in to any moment in the series, they had to know exactly where they were. there couldn't be any confusion between where what elf was, where a dwarf was, where a halfling was, where a human was, and a human was in the Southland, a human was at Numenor. All of those things
Mhm.
had to be crystal clear as to where exactly you were, which meant we had to figure out a very specific visual context for each of those cultures. And then the third thing was, of course, it's Tolkien. There's a deep, deep history of Tolkien, and there's a deep reverence for Tolkien. And we already have really wonderful movies. The Peter Jackson movies are really wonderfully done. And our story was happening 3,000 years ahead of those Peter Jackson movies. So we had to figure out the way to engage in the dialogue with those movies, that's where the world was going to be 3,000 years later after ours, and also engage with the sense that there is 70, 80 years of art about Tolkien. And so we had to try to figure out what is that DNA of Tolkien that we could put into every frame while making it real and
Mhm.
while making it completely recognizable to an audience member. So that was the job that I was given. And then the way to solve that is, all kinds of ways with all kinds of people. But it came down to, what did Tolkien say? What are the words telling us? What does the showrunner want the story to go? Because that's really what we're doing, is we're working with the idea of what this overarching story is, and we have to figure out how to provide the context for that overall story. And so it's looking back into history, it's looking into the forward of the scripts, it's
Mhm.
finding the words between Tolkien and between the words in the script, and pulling the elements out of that, and then trying to figure out what each culture is about based on that. So as a brief example, the elves we know from Tolkien were first birthed on the edge of a lake, and there was no sun, there was no moon, there were only stars. The sun and the moon hadn't been created yet, they weren't necessary in Tolkien's cosmology. So they were in a forest and they had stars. And so everything about elves comes from that pure beginning, because elves don't forget anything and they live forever. So they're all connected back to that beginning. So their architecture speaks to the forests. So it's not about saying elves are about Art Nouveau or elves are about Gothic. It's about
Mhm.
elves are about how do you create an architecture that's based on plant forms. And so we literally just went back in and looked at trees and looked at Karl Blossfeld's photographs, his Victorian photographs of plant structures, and then compared how that worked its way into various cultural manifestations in our world. And landed on Latin, Celtic, ancient Celtic art has a very interesting kind of organic characteristic to it. And we could filter that through trees and through a sense of what we recognize as Art Nouveau and what we recognize as Gothic, and try to find the form language that expresses it. So essentially everything about elves became organic and became vertical
Mhm.
and became based on greens and golds, because that's where nature is, and this emphasis of stars, which opposed to dwarves, which were all about, Tolkien says they were of stone and of fire. So they were also created kind of in an act of rebellion against the main god. So they have this very sense of this, they're very important to themselves
Mhm.
because they were created separately from all the other races. And so you're looking for the sense of how that reflects. And you know that they were created by a god who was a maker god. And so everything about them is about making, and that there is that of stone and of fire. So you kind of come into a world that, opposed to the verticality of elves and the organic forms of elves, you kind of come into this, both this kind of horizontal world of the stone compressing and also the diamond shapes of mountains,
Mhm.
and then the sense that everything has to come from that stone. And so all the architecture ends up growing out of the stone. It's not that they're enforcing their will on the stone. They do that later. That's what happens in Moria. That's how Khazad-dûm falls, because the dwarves got greedy and they worked too hard. So this world was about how they revered the stone. So it's like, it's those types of things where you break into the idea of who the culture is
Mhm.
and where the words lead you between the showrunners and the director, and you start to find these components that allow you to start to say, this is the world.
That's quite extraordinary. It's almost as if I mean, suddenly just listening to that narrative, you've certainly transported me to another world, and I get the sense that you're sort of having to live and breathe that, And until you're convinced of that environment,
Mm.
you can't get the audience to believe you. So I guess that the question would be, in order, would the success of a particular project be very much dependent on how much immersed you are in the story and how whether you believe it or not?
Definitely. I mean, I won't. I try not to. Every once in a while, I'll take a job just because I'm taking a job because, I want to work with the director or, I should make this move to work with the studio or whatever. But most of the time, 95% of the time, I will only take a job because there's something in the material that I really, really connect with. And that I may not know that when I first read the script. And sometimes I'll go, okay, people think this is a good script. It's got some good people attached to it. Let me figure out what it is, and then I will dive into research because that's where I start on every project. Is I pick out the scenes and the characters and the references that are in the script, and I start to pull reference on that. And as I start to pull that reference, and I start to see imagery that speaks to me, and then I start to see how one image speaks to me and another image speaks to me, and how those two images on the surface may not actually relate, but through the combination of the story that they allow me to make that connection between those images, that's where I all of a sudden get really passionate about the project. And it's like you mentioned 10 Cloverfield Lane, and there was on the surface, it's this weird guy in a bunker. What's interesting about that? And as I did the research and learned about what preppers and doomsday people believe and how they make the process of what they're trying to create that world to make it safe for themselves and why it's important to make it safe for themselves, I could suddenly create a whole backstory for Howard as to when he built which parts of that bunker and why he built each part of that bunker. And that's how I could also keep the audience engaged, that they would know where they were in each part of the bunker because each part came from a different point in Howard's life, had a different function for why Howard was building. It all had to do with his family and his daughter. And all that backstory led to the interaction that he has with the characters in the story because that built the ground plan. And that's not anything that the director brought to the mix, right? That's what I came up with. And then I pitched it to the director in the studio and they loved it, right? So suddenly I'm actually helping write the story. And that's what production design does. It's not just picking a chair or a piece of painting on the wall or saying I'm going to put a tree here. It's really about how does the visual context of the narrative of the media tell the story and create the backdrop. I mean, the most kind of prevalent example of that is I recently did a film called No One Will Save You, where there's no dialogue in the movie. The entire movie has no dialogue. And it's a very complicated backstory about this young woman and the history that happened in her and why she's ended up in the place where she is and why she decides she has to stick and stay and fight for her home, and you don't get any exposition. So that became the job of the production design to actually tell all of that backstory. And you work with the director to kind of pitch ideas, and he likes them, or talked to the actress, and she had some ideas that she wanted to bring into it, talk to the DP, because where he's going to light it and where he's going to point the camera, that's where you get the information, right? If I create all this stuff and the DP is like over here shooting something that then we're not getting the story. So that always has to be part of the context is where the director is placing the performance, right? Because remember, it's two things: it's the visual context and it's the performance. So you got to be working with all of those people to make sure that all of that is coming together.
And in terms, I guess at the end of the day, everything's pretty much determined by. I mean, you've got the creativity and the vision, but also budget has a
Oh,
huge thing to play. So, I guess it's interesting and I guess very challenging that obviously if budget is not an issue, then fantastic. You just go wild on your
well,
creativity.
but budget is never not an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's it. It literally makes no difference. I've done 99-seat theater and I've done Lord of the Rings, right? And I've worked on Marvel movies. I designed an entire land in a theme park. So you would think that in those other ends of it, that you have all the money in the world, and in some ways you do, but that also means that the expectations have grown to meet the expenses.
Mhm.
And so the appetite is always larger than the budget. And even in the case of Lord of the Rings, it kind of it's frustrating to hear people talk about it being the most expensive thing ever made for television, right? Because there's a lot of context in there that's not clear. They spent $250 million for the rights, so
Wow.
that's a
Wow.
whole hunk
Gosh.
of money that just we don't get to see any of that.
Wow. Okay.
But that was only the rights to the books and the appendices. We couldn't even
Wow.
actually use the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales or any other writing of Tolkien. We just had to use the Lord of the Rings and the appendices in the Lord of the Rings. So that's a whole nother story.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
but the but and then when you think about Lord of the Rings, it's over 8 hours of media, right? A Marvel movie is 2.5 hours
Hmm.
of media. You spend $250 million creating a Marvel movie for two and a half. We had less than that to create 8 hours of equal scope and visual complexity and density. So while it sounds like we had $200 million to make the first season, it's particularly when you strip out actors and writers and producers and location costs and all of that stuff, we had significantly less money to make that than you would have had to have made a standard Hollywood tentpole movie. So it's always about figuring out you have this much money and you have this much appetite, and what are you going to do to get
Hmm.
that all together? And that ends up being all about the conversations with the producers and the DP and the director and with visual effects in terms of what you're going to build practically and what's going to go into that visual effects world, and then figuring out how to fit it in the box.
Wow. I mean, putting all of that into context, it's quite miraculous to even see things that actually go over the line and are ready to be enjoyed.
Yeah.
Wow. You mentioned, I mean, you've done some extraordinary work in Guardians of the Galaxy too, and you've worked on the one of the Captain America movies. There's another one coming up next year, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. Theme parks. I looked up this extraordinary thing, Disney's California Adventure, the Avengers Campus, and you worked on that. Just let the audience know, for people who haven't visited, and certainly we're based in the UK, and people may not have heard of this thing, but what is the Avengers Campus?
Basically, Disney's the both the kind of emotional cycle of Disney as well as the financial cycle of Disney is how you repurpose things that people like in different contexts, right? And one of the ways that Disney constantly um, has been successful and brings a great deal of enjoyment in people's life while making good money is through theme parks. And, from the original 1955 Disneyland, and coming into the future where they've got 8 theme parks or whatever all around the world and building more. Um, so what they try to do is to, again, it's about visual context. In this case, it's not about visual context on a 2D screen in front of you. It's about visual context where you actually are able to enter the world and participate in the world yourself in a physical way. And what they wanted to do was figure out a way to bring the idea of the Avengers and Marvel movies into a physical space in the real world. And what they kind of landed on was the idea was that particularly after the narrative of the movies and the blip and on that complication of losing all of humanity, half of humanity, and getting them back, and all these bad things are out in the world, was that the storyline of what we were trying to create was that the world needs more heroes so that we can face these challenges. So the idea was, how would the Avengers create a campus where they could train future heroes? And so that's what the land is, right? In its overarching story. And then again, you come up with a backstory. And that's where production design comes in again, because again, when I joined the project, they already had a couple of rides and they had a couple of ideas for restaurants. And they'd done a ground plan for how people, because it had to fit into where an existing space within the park. Um, but what I brought to it was to say, okay, what happens? Why is this here? And why are these things here? So it was coming up with this whole backstory about Tony Stark's dad and the idea that he had a facility that he was trying to build flying cars, And then they discovered that there was this magical anomaly in the space. And then so other people, the various entities within the marble world came to study this anomaly, and it eventually built up into just kind of a facility where stuff was being studied. And then, as things do in this world, something went horribly wrong, and the magical anomaly blew up, and then it got abandoned. And now Tony's going, well, I remember my dad has this facility out in California. And so let's repurpose that facility as a training center. And this building will do that. And this building will do this. And this building will do that. And so and then the collector heard about all of this, and so he teleported his tower into this space so he could observe what the Avengers were up to here, right? So it kind of created this whole backstory about what this environment is. And what it does is creates a context for a couple of restaurants for an interactive ride about Spider-Man, a whole bunch of stunt shows. They're now working on another attraction to add into it. But it's a place where people, kids, can go and actually get to interact with their heroes. And that's what makes the land particularly alive, is that it's got this great live entertainment component where there are actors, there are heroes interacting with the guests. And it is a contextualization, it's a of the idea of what it takes to be a hero and how we can be heroes as well. So again, it's this high level story, but then it's
Mhm.
also about you can drink a beer, so
Mhm.
it's how do you make all those contexts together.
I think it's fascinating. Um, the Before I touch on the next question, I mean, obviously, as mentioned before, you've worked on some incredible projects, and you've got more in the pipeline. For maybe a younger audience who are listening and avidly about getting into the industry, how did you end up working in TV in Hollywood from from starting off helping out with stage production in the evenings? What was that transition? What were the sort of breaks or the opportunities that presented themselves?
At the University of Wyoming, when I was graduating, I loved directing, and I was given an opportunity to be the first person to design for the main stage, to actually do a stage design, set design for the main stage. And I discovered that I really, really loved that. That was a wonderful process. And so I applied to various graduate programs around the country and got accepted in directing on the East Coast and design on the West Coast. And from being a Wyoming boy, the East Coast sounded terrifying. So I went to the West Coast because at least they were Westerners like me. Of course, California is nothing like Wyoming, and the school was nothing like the University of Wyoming, Cal Arts. And I just, what that provided to me by making that decision was I was meeting people who were working in the industry
Mhm.
so that I was making connections. And I had to do my senior thesis, and I ended up, and this is just how random it all is, right? So my senior thesis was designing a musical for a stage, and I knew that there was a lighting designer in Los Angeles who was also from Wyoming, and she was 10 years older than I am. She was very well established. So I asked her to be my thesis guider on this project. And she said, well, I don't know anything about set design really, so I'm going to bring in a friend of mine who's a set designer, a guy by the name of John Iacobelli. And I interacted with John, and John got hired to be the art director on when the Cosby Show had, again, it's all random. The Cosby Show, there was a big strike in New York. So the Cosby Show, where it was normally shot, had to be moved to California that summer to be to be produced because these our people weren't striking in LA, but they were striking in New York. So he was hired to do that, and he brought me on as his production assistant.
Mhm.
And then so I got onto the Cosby Show and I met those people, and that became, and then they were also doing A Different World and Roseanne. And then John left to go do a movie, and all of a sudden, I literally, from the day I graduated on Friday, I started on Monday. 3 months later, I was the art director on A Different World. And then halfway through that year, I became an art director on Roseanne. And as this 23, 24-year-old guy, all of a sudden had all this responsibility and this project where back in that time, it was all non-union. So I did everything. I was the set designer. I did the drafting. I did the model building. I shopped all the furniture and oversaw all the crews. I even had to run the trucks. So I just learned so much
Hmm.
about what happened behind and in front of the camera. And literally every step of the way, it has been that. I met somebody doing research up where I was doing some research on a theater, and I met a guy at the research library, and we had a really great conversation. And a couple of months later, he remembered me, and when he had to leave a job, he asked if I could come in. And so I met Alex McDowell, who's a fantastic designer because he was working for Alex, and that got me into commercials. And by doing commercials and music videos with Alex, in the long run, that's why I ended up at Imagineering because they wanted somebody to help design the Rock and Roller Coaster, and they wanted somebody who understood music videos, but also had a theater background to kind of contextualize musical videos in a real space. So I got brought in to help design this roller coaster. And then after I'd done a little bit of work on in Imagineering, designing various things, one of the guys I had met through Alex McDowell was working on AI, artificial intelligence with Spielberg, and they needed somebody who understood visual narrative media, but also understood theme parks. So he brought me in
Wow.
to help design the Coney Island sequence of AI, artificial
Right.
intelligence. So it's like literally a sequence of meeting people and just making those connections. And that's honest to God.
Hmm.
You have to know what you're doing. You have to have the skill sets to do what you're doing. And that's in the case of production design, it's very tangible things. You have to be able to draw or paint or illustrate or model so that you have that entree into the language of the craft. And then you have to show up and you have to go beyond. Like I
Hmm.
said, you start at super early in the morning, you end super late at night because you're doing everything you can to because one, you should love it. So that's part of why you're there, the passion of it, but then you just meet people along the way. And by being good at what you do and being passionate about doing it, and you meet people and they see all of that, and then they bring you along the line. And literally, practically everything I've ever done follows that chain of somebody I met somewhere along the line. Even Lord of the Rings is I because of 10 Cloverfield. Well, I was supervising art director on Star Trek Into Darkness, so I met all the
Hmm.
bad robot folk, right? And had a really
Oh,
great
okay.
time on that. And and they really liked what I was doing. So when 10 Cloverfield came along,
Hmm.
the one of the producers said, "Well, let's talk to Ramsey." And it's funny because I came into this interview and I was terrified because one of the first things I really interviewed for, and I get this big hug from JJ. I'm like, "Oh, okay, everything's gonna be okay." And had this interview and it went well. And then the project was one of those projects where, no money at all, out in the middle of cane fields in Louisiana, and just problem solving and everybody working together and having a really good time on this
Hmm.
little tiny film that had no money, and trying to figure out how to make this all happen. And that producer, Lindsay Weber, was then in one of the executive producers on Lord of the Rings. And so I 10 years later, right? My husband designs and produces theme parks.
Hmm.
And we saw Netflix was building this theme park division. And we were wondering, well, does Amazon have a theme park division? So I called up Lindsay and said, hey, does Amazon have a theme park division? Because we'd like to talk about maybe helping them with that if they have one. And she said, no, Amazon isn't doing theme parks, but what are you doing? And I'd actually called right in the middle of this whole kerfluffle they were having with the other designer. So because I called at the right time to the right person, all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, I'm on a plane to New Zealand. And that's
Wow.
just how it works. It's just how it works.
As you said in your previous field, that the stars aligned,
Yeah,
and it happens. But I think the point you made earlier is so important that just by sitting there waiting for this eclipse to happen, it won't do anything unless you're involved, unless you're making moves, unless you're immersing yourself in the industry that you want to end up getting into.
yeah,
No one's going to take notice of you and your efforts, and no one's going to see it. So you have to be present whilst
yeah,
all of this is going on, and then hopefully you'll get noticed through your
yeah.
efforts. But what an incredible
Yeah.
story! So now, when I was reading your bio, this really this is really extraordinary. I wanted to explain production design for a royal Saudi wedding.
Again, it's just about the weird context, right? One of my best friends from Cal Arts is a lighting designer.
Hmm.
And his girlfriend at the time was working for an interior designer, and she did the palaces for this particular branch of the royal family.
Hmm.
And so they had asked her to do the wedding presentation. A wedding in Saudi Arabia, particularly a royal one, isn't anything like we think of them, really. The ceremony is private. You don't actually see the ceremony.
Hmm.
It's really about the presentation of the bride to the important people that the family wants to introduce the bride to. And of course, when
Hmm.
you're a princess, that's quite a few very important people. So it's a very theatrical event, and the the interior designer didn't know about theater, so she asked her assistant if she could put her in contact with anybody, and the assistant said, "Well, my boyfriend is a lighting designer in theater. Let's ask him." And then so he recommended me to the job, and I came in and I was showing her some of the theater work that I had done, and there are a couple of images that she really liked, and she said, "We're going to do that." So literally, she took a couple of designs that I'd already done and said, "What I want you to do is recreate a version of that in some hotels in Riyadh."
Wow.
So, so basically, that's what we did. Is that we understood that there's an area where you do a presentation. There's an area where there's a banquet. There's an area where there's a dance, and it's all women because men aren't allowed at
Hmm.
all in any of this. The husband comes to make one moment of presentation and then he leaves. And then so it was really about crafting this environment, figuring out how to build it, how to rent the pieces here, um, working with her to interface with the Saudis and figuring out how to get things on boats to get to there and then installing it. And I mean, it's still like the very first day, all the stuff comes in these containers on these trucks off the boats, and the trucks get to the theater, the Intercontinental, the hotel where the theater is going to be installed in a ballroom, and get everything unloaded. And there's literally a dust storm blowing
Wow.
on the horizon, and the guys with the truck say, because it's all about hospitality, right? The culture has
Hmm.
this deep
Hmm.
sense of hospitality. And so they said, you have to drink tea with us. So as this sandstorm is brewing out here, they open a panel on the side of the semi, and using the heat from the engine, they brew tea. And we sit there and we drink our tea. Sandstorm's getting closer. Finally, like, bye, and go inside the door as the sandstorm hits. And that was kind of our introduction to this is what it's going to be like to be in Saudi Arabia for 2 weeks. Just both the warmth of the people and also the kind of drama of being in this. And this was in the 90s, so it was a very different place than it is now,
Hmm.
you know. And it was fascinating. It was super
Wow.
fascinating. And I brought the woman who was my mentor on my thesis project. I brought her along to be the overall lighting designer on the project. So again, it's all about those
Hmm.
connections, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
So
And I bet it just looked splendid.
it did. It did. It's one of the things I really just don't have good pictures of.
Of course.
Um, Unfortunately, I just don't have good pictures of it. But it was one of those remarkable moments in your life. You go, I can't believe I'm doing a wedding for a princess. That's just
I just stood out to. I thought, okay, this is really no one's going to have this on their CV. Quite. And have you been invited to production design similar sort of celebration since then?
No, I mean, I don't know with the whole. Well, I've done things. I have done other types of
Hmm.
location-based design. I did the holiday decorations for the city of Santa Monica, for example.
Hmm.
So all the streetscape for a couple of years, I did the design of creating the scenery and the lighting for this for Christmas decorations along this
Hmm.
promenade in the street. So I've done a couple of those types of things along the way. What I do for film or TV is so in time intensive that
Hmm.
it's hard for me to do other things. So those other things kind of fit in between when I have some kind of some
Sure.
downtime.
Maybe part of your retirement plan.
Could be.
And no, obviously, there's a huge project coming up next year, amongst other things that you're doing. Are you allowed to talk about that?
Actually, there's two that are really, really
Oh,
big
okay. The one I
projects. So I
read
mean,
about was the Captain America: Brave New World.
yeah. So I can say mostly that it's coming out and there's a trailer, and that the gist of that project, in some ways, kind of not dissimilar from Lord of the Rings, just in a different
Mhm,
context, is that the goal for that particular story was to reground the Marvel universe. So to get it back within a context of the real world and strip out a lot of the visual effects and
mm,
the extravagant kind of nature that Marvel had been growing into. I mean, not that they're stripping that out of their
mhm,
overall
mhm,
storytelling, but in this particular instance, the goal was to keep it grounded and to find the way to place the story specifically within the context of our real world. Um, and one of the things that's tricky about that is that grounded and real still has to be cinematic. It still has to have scope and it has to bring people to see things into the theater, and it still has to do that context. What's
mhm,
the story we're trying to tell, and what's the visual narrative around what's the visual context around that narrative? So that again, it was a whole bunch of discussions with the director and with the studio and the writers about how to tie all those pieces together and tell this um, kind of paranoid political thriller within a Marvel context, and on a budget because Marvel wanted to actually stop to try to figure out how to make movies on a significantly less amount of money
mm,
than they had been spending. So again, it is a business. It's show business. It is a business. And so all of the art that we try to bring to it still has to fit within the context of a schedule and a budget and has to make a profit. So that there's that all of that is part of what we do. It's just not coming up with pretty pictures. It is pretty pictures that tell a story within a financial and logistical
mm,
framework. And then the other project is I was actually in India for 6 months working on the Ramayana, that basically telling of one of the foundational Hindu
mhm,
texts as a more, and it was kind of the exact opposite, where Captain America was all about being in camera and grounded. This is all about trying to make a really brilliant um, evocation of a long lost world within the context of what what kind of is a perception of Hindu visuals, like the calendar art for the last 100 years of how people have processed the visuals of Hinduism, and how do you turn that into something that's physical and and it can tell a story, and how do you put actors into the middle of
mm,
that, working with a company that wants to do it all as a visual effects movie. So two very different projects,
mhm,
but still
mhm,
it comes down to there is a context that we want to tell these stories in, and and how do you do it with the
mhm,
tools you got and the people you have, and the way they make films in India is so very different than the way we make films in the West. Very, very, very different. So trying to figure out how to work within that system and help to, because that's the way they do things is very hands-on. And
mhm,
in a visual effects movie, there's nothing to have put your hands on, right? It's all pixels. So how do you redo a process that's based on having a lot of people spending a lot of time building things to figure out how to create that story and that visual within a context where it's completely ephemeral now.
mhm,
So it
mhm,
was very interesting. That one's probably not going to come out till 2026 at this
mhm.
point, I think. So,
So what was your experience in India? Where are the sort of the places that you went for research, or some of the places that inspired you the most, or things that really struck out to you?
um,
I'm asking because I'm from India, so it'd be
uh,
interesting to understand
well,
your reflections of that.
we were filming in Mumbai,
Hmm.
and because it's a visual effects movie, there wasn't a lot of location. There was no location work actually because it's all being done on stage. Um, so basically, what I tried to do was on the weekends get out to places to kind of get a feeling for the the vibe and the
Hmm.
history and the look, and the energy. I mean, Mumbai is a fascinating city. I
Hmm.
loved Mumbai, just loved it. But we got out to the Elora and Ajanta caves, which was just remarkable. The architecture, the history, the paintings are just mind blowing, mind blowing.
Mhm.
And spent a weekend in Varanasi, and the layering of the history there and the sense of how the religion is layered into the architecture
Mhm.
was very eye-opening for me. Got to a couple of the step wells in Rajasthan, and to look at the epicness of that kind of architecture. Um, all of those things, like bits and pieces of it. I mean, again, when you're talking about this particular storytelling, it's way before any of that, right? It's thousands of years before any of this. But like I said, when you filter it through the conception, in some of the same ways that you're filtering Lord of the Rings through a
Mhm. Mhm.
preconceived sense of what it should look like, here those elements of what is in the real world were very valuable. We didn't.
Mhm. Mhm.
It can't be prehistoric because that's not how the story is perceived, and not even really how it's written. So we're having to try to figure out how to filter those things that an audience expects into
Mhm.
into the environment around them. So it was through those types of travels and lots of talking.
Mhm.
I'm clearly it was a very odd position to be this white guy, trying to tell this very important story that I have only my major connection through it is through Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, and that it's one version of the hero's journey, right? So I'd had some familiarity with the storytelling of it, but it's really just talking to people all the time and listening to not only what are the beats of the story, but why are the beats important? And what's the emotional connection to those beats in the story? And how do we then turn that emotional connection into something physical or visual, not physical, because it's all visual effects.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's kind
I'm
of
very much looking
that.
forward to seeing that. I recall there used to be a very long TV productions with very lavish set
Yeah.
design and costumes, and the series would go on so many hundreds of episodes. So it'd be really interesting to see
Yeah.
how you reimagine those using today's technology for newer generation.
And that's exactly, it's a very similar thing to what we did. You have to have a dialogue with that in the same way that in Lord of the Rings, you have to have a dialogue with the Peter Jackson movies. That television series is so foundational to so many people's visual understanding of that story that you have to kind of acknowledge that it's there and either respond to or work against, but they're choices. You're making very deliberate choices, not just in the visuals, but in the way the story is told. So it it nothing happens in a void. Everything is happening within a cultural context in any storytelling. And part of our job as a production designer is to figure out what parts of that cultural context apply specifically to this story and how do we evoke them.
And I hope you enjoy plenty of cups of chai.
Oh man, I miss it here. I just nobody in LA I found so far has chai like
Oh,
I like like we did in Mumbai. It was amazing.
so that's a business opportunity for someone out there. So
Right.
if
I,
anyone's
I'm I'm
listening,
sure there
Jai in
is.
LA.
I don't live near some of the more dense South
Oh,
Asian communities, so I'm sure there is. It's just where I live in the valley. It's no.
oh gosh. And coming on to that, judging by the fact that it's so early where you are now, and you're so busy, coming up with the designs to bring these things into reality. If and when you do get time to enjoy TV or music or movies, what are some of your favorite things that come to mind?
Um, I still love live theater. I love going to live theater. It's incredibly expensive to go to live theater
It
anymore.
is.
So,
It is.
like, yow. We were trying to, we have a little stopover in New York for our Christmas travels, and we were trying to see a show. And like, tickets were $430 a seat. It's like,
Oof.
holy
Wow.
cow. Although a friend of mine designed something that just opened on Broadway, and it's got this amazing stagecraft, and since it just opened, the tickets are affordable. So I love seeing live theater because there's this it's a very clear relationship between the audience and the performance. It doesn't happen without the actual audience there. And so understanding how that kind of visual context works with a literal audience in the space is really, I love that. I just love being part of that. So live theater is important. Um, in terms of movies, I'm a kind of a genre guy. I do certainly like fantasy and science fiction. Um, I think the thing that I'm most excited about right now, strangely enough, is the second season of Arcane, because the first season was so beautifully done. And I'm very curious to see how they carry that story through. I love animation. That's something, when you speak of world building, animation is one of the more purest versions of that, because not only are you having to come up with it, but you're literally making every single thing that happens in the frame. You're not going to a location, you're not building a set. You have to, and not only is it a thing, but it also is a completely different context based on the style. You know, if you look at a Miyazaki movie versus a Disney movie versus a Illumination movie, just the style of those is very different. And how do those styles affect the way the visuals are put together? So I love seeing animation as well. So those kind of the things I tend toward. Um, just started For All Mankind, saw the first season of For All Mankind, which I think is a wonderfully done project on every level. You know, so
Fantastic. I've got a couple of recommendations for the theatre. Back to the Future, the musical, is incredible.
yeah, I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
No.
if you're a fan of the films, it's a brilliant show, and
Yeah.
you'll love the stage production.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
And if you're a fan of Stranger Things, then Stranger Things on stage, again, amazing production.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by that one. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You'll enjoy those. And if there are any particular projects or dreams of things that you'd want to work on, I'd love to know what sort of things would Ramsey, what would be that phone call that this is just, I know everything's been an amazing opportunity, but what are you waiting for? Whose call are you waiting for to work on?
Um, I it's funny because there are any number of wonderful directors that I'd love the opportunity to work with or work for. The I think the thing though, it's strange. I'm from Wyoming. I'm from the Wild West, right? And I have never done a Western. I have never worked on a Western. And I would love to do a Western, you know. That would be the one call where it's like, okay, yeah, whatever. For wherever I am in the world, I wanna go do a Western. I think
Fantastic.
part of the thing, while I say I'm a genre guy, I really love telling stories. And that the more human the story is, the more I enjoy doing it. So while I have this kind of reputation of doing these big world building types of projects, I would be just as happy to do something like The King's Speech, you know, that it's a very tight, intimate story that still has a strong visual context. You have to create the world that is happening in, and so those characters inhabit the right space. And so that type of a project, I would be very interested in, a much smaller kind of evocative period piece as well. I would love to do something like that.
It's been such a fantastic opportunity learning from you and just getting more from your experiences and just sharing all of this with the world. We're very much excited to see what lavish productions you work on in future. I would love to see a decent western. I've not seen a good one in ages, so
Yeah, true,
you
true.
let's get a good western out. We want you to be working on that. Ramsey, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your morning. Enjoy the rest
Well,
of your
thank you.
day, and all the very best in future. And as I
Well,
said, we
thank you
very
very
much look
much.
forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Well, and thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye.